Hello, Standards-Based Grading Pilot member. I just wanted to make a quick presentation to talk a little bit more about the pilot and what we're going to be trying to accomplish next year when we start using standards-based grading practices inside our classrooms. Standards-based grading, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but at this point, here's sort of our working definition, and as time goes on we might want to change it, but I've sort of looked at various definitions on the internet, I've read research and stuff, and I've kind of put together my own definition, but basically we're going to define standards-based grading with grading students' knowledge and ability based only on outcomes from their official performance. Our goal with this pilot is to find out what students know and what they can do based upon the required standards that are in our respective classes that we teach. And that's really what we're trying to figure out is what do our kids know? Not what can they turn in, not what can they do to get some extra points. We just want to find out what they know, and that's what we want to grade them on. Therefore, we will be judging, when we use standards-based grading, we will be judging a student's knowledge or ability of a standard by their performance on assessments, assignments, and projects that have been developed to specifically assess that respective standard. Therefore, anything that you want to create in your class, any sort of assessment that you think is valid and one that will show if a student has knowledge on the curriculum that you're teaching, you can use. That's fine. But that's how we're going to find out if kids know their information. We will not judge a student's knowledge or ability of a standard by their performance on work involving behavior, compliance, or practice. So no more are we going to include parent signatures, homework, in-class worksheets, Bell worksheet, class participation, citizenship. Those are all things that maybe we can find a way to communicate to parents and students, but we will not use those things for students' final grades. It will be whatever assessments that you want to use that will ultimately indicate whether or not students know the information. That doesn't mean we're not going to use homework. That doesn't mean that worksheets or class participation won't be important, because obviously students need to be doing those things in order to learn material so they can then show their proficiency. But ultimately, with standards-based grading, we only want to measure a student's ability by the assessments that we are creating, that are sort of the official assessments that will decide does the student know it or not. In terms of the process for our pilot, I kind of have 4 steps that I've sort of created or thought out. And the first step is we need to all create report cards using a template that I'm going to provide you. Your report card needs to include the following 2 things. In your report card, you need to include all of the Common Core standards that are respective to your subject. And then you need to include all of your curriculum content that is respective to your subject. I'm going to talk more about the report card in another video. I'm going to show you an example, show you kind of how the template works, and try to speak more clearly to this. But that will be the first part, and that will be probably the most important part, and that will be the part that I'm hoping we can have completed by the beginning of the school year. In step 2, I'd like you to become familiar with the 0 to 4 grade scale that all of our classes will use to assess students. The 0 to 4 grade scale is something that many people who research standards-based grading suggest that people use. It's also a grade scale that's being adopted by our 3rd grade classrooms in our district starting next year. Within 2 to 3 years, those kids and parents who eventually come to middle school will be familiar with it. That doesn't mean in 2 to 3 years we'll be using standards-based grading in the middle school, but it just says that there is a grade of students that will be familiar with this. And basically, if you look at your grade scale, you will see what a 4 means. It means that you have exceeded the end of the year standard, and then a 3.5 is sort of a, yeah, you've hit sometimes partial success at 4, but you are definitely above just having met the year standard. And as you just go through here, you can see what a 2.5, a 2, which is really considered on target to meet at the end of the year, and then what a 1.5, 1, and 0 is. But that will be the scale that we're using, and so the first thing we want to be thinking about with standards-based grading is we need to try to get ourselves away from the letter grades. We want to just think, can students do what we're asking them to do, and then can they do it better than we've asked? Can they do what we've asked, or are they not doing it? And sometimes in my own practices, I still go back to letter grade thinking, but we want to try to get away from that. We don't want to try to think, oh, that's B work or C work. We want to try to stay in that 0 to 4 guideline. In step 3, I'd like you to consider how you'll assess your students. I want you to be thinking, what kind of assessments are you going to be able to give your students for them to be able to demonstrate their knowledge of your subject or the Common Core standards that we're all expected to teach. You might already have grade assessments already created, but perhaps you're going to start thinking about respective standards and saying, gosh, I don't know if I really have an assessment that specifically speaks to that. And therefore, I just want you to begin thinking, what are you going to be creating for this? Are you going to be doing projects? Are you going to be doing assignments? Is there essays? Or are you going to be doing multiple choice tests? But please just begin thinking how you will assess those standards. And then finally, I just want you to continue being the great teacher that you are and see what you can learn about the process using standards-based grading in your classroom. I am honored to be able to work with the 8 individuals who have agreed to sign up for this pilot. I think everybody has a lot to share and has a real interest and unbiased passion to bring for this process. And so thank you again for agreeing to do this. I realize this is extra work, but I really believe that we'll all be better educators for doing this, and I think we're going to come up with some interesting answers to a lot of questions that I have. This is kind of, in the last year, SIT has had a lot of discussions about grading, and we've talked about everything from zeros to standards-based grading to all of the sort of nitty-gritty questions in between, and they're really hard questions. And so this year, by doing the standard, I really want to learn about best practices for standards-based grading. In theory, it works great, but then all of a sudden you have a classroom of 25 kids, and now all of a sudden maybe the theory isn't going to work so good, or there's going to be a lot of gray. And so I'm hoping through our trials that we can learn about the following questions. And these are just questions that I've been thinking about or listened to over the last year, but I'd like you to keep an open mind, and as you practice standards-based grading in your classroom, please see, have you started to think about answers to this? Because I don't have them, but I'm hoping that by the end of the year we as a cohort can maybe come up with some answers or some practice or some norm behavior that we can then share with other staff members of this is how we're going to answer this sort of murky question. The first question is about assessments. What's the best type of assessments for standards-based grading? Is it multiple choice, essay, short answer project, oral assessments, worksheet assignments? I have my own opinions as to I think what works good, but what are yours? And everybody's subject is a little bit different in terms of the information we're looking for, the skills that we're trying to assess, and therefore which assessments work best for you, or is there one that for the whole group works? My other question though is, what elements are best that go into an assessment? How can we make sure our assessments are fairly reliable and are actually assessing the knowledge we're looking for? Questions that I've asked is, if we're going to use a multiple choice assessment, should there be a minimum number of questions to assess one standard with? Well, okay, if there should be, what's a fair minimum? How does a 4-3-2-1 get determined using multiple choice questions? I think rubrics are definitely a large part of the assessments that we're going to be giving, but do we always have to make a rubric? Again, I'm not sure. Other ways to demonstrate knowledge, something I've talked a lot about or thought a lot about is, what if a student can demonstrate knowledge orally by telling you the answer or telling you information, but they can't write it? How do we assess this? How do we score this? Is it 2 separate grades? Is it 1 separate grade? Performance deadlines. If a student must give a speech or a presentation to class or has to meet a deadline and does not, how do we assess this in a manner that falls within our standards-based grading guidelines? I've talked to language arts teachers, and they've talked about book talks, how students get to choose the day they want to go and give their talk, but then some of them don't have one. So therefore, do they just get a 0? But on the other hand, we never saw them talk, so we don't know what they can do. But at the same time, we don't have an entire year to beg the student to do something. So where does that fall? What do we do when kids are not making the deadlines to turn things in? It's sort of a behavior that we're grading because they're not doing something, but at the same time there's a practical part of this. It just says, do we still just say, we tried, we have to give them a 0 because they did not do it? But I'd love some more information on that. What if standards are tested more than once? For instance, what if you give 2 claims and evidence writing assignments in the same quarter? How do we grade it? Does the most recent attempt override the first attempt? Are they averaged together? What if the first attempt is higher than the second attempt? How do we grade that on a report card? Should standards be tested more than once throughout the year? In the elementary, you'll see that they break down all their standards by quarter. Some of them, some of their standards seem to be assessed more than once, but others seem only once in the year. What about Common Core? Should we be assessing that every quarter? That's more of a skill thing than a content thing, because for the most part, all of us, when we teach content, it gets taught once and then we move on. What about content standards? What if a student demonstrates knowledge of a content standard in the second quarter, but they didn't have it in the first? Do we go back? Do we change that? Again, I feel like these are sort of good questions that I have no answers to, and I'm hoping that as a group, maybe we can at least come to our best answer. Could a final exam replace all previous tests? What if a student shows knowledge at the end of a term, but never before then? Are all other official attempts forgotten? If you can do it on a final exam, but you couldn't do it on, maybe an assessment in the middle of the term, what do you do? Do teachers need to use the same assessments? Theoretically, someday, if teachers of the same grade are both using standards-based grading, do they need to use the same test to get information, or can they make their own? Do we need to have a consistency guideline to this? I could see where maybe one teacher thinks that their assessment is good and the other one thinks that their own is good, but perhaps one is harder than the other, or one is not so good. Do we need to have consistency, or should people still be given that freedom? What if a student exceeds at a standard in September? So basically the year begins and that student says, boom, I get a 4 on multiple parts of the report card. So now technically they've exceeded what we've expected of them. What do we do with these students? Should we be giving them an extra project? Do we give them 8th grade standards or a grade above them standards to work on? Or do we just give them a pat on the back and say, nice job? But then the problem is what if that student becomes a behavior problem because they're done, but nobody else is? What if a student does worse on a standard in 4th quarter than they did in 1st quarter? Do we take an average? Does it just mean that that student is capable, but not on the day the standard was assessed most recently? And how does this reflect upon the teacher? I would assume none of us want to see our students kind of regressing in their abilities during 4th quarter, and therefore, how do we handle that sort of thing? Do teachers need to teach the same standards in the same quarter? What if one teacher runs out of time or has something else they need to fit in? Is this a problem? Is it okay if, again, not everybody is totally consistent with their grade level counterpart? Is it okay if certain things are different in one class or another? Do we need consistency? I'm also very curious about the classroom experience. Is it different? What's it like? Is it more positive? Is it more negative? How's all this classroom time used? If technically we're not grading homework and we're not grading participation and stuff like that, we're only grading outcomes. How is the classroom experience different, or how is time being used? And I guess that will be something that it will be more anecdotal evidence, but I'm just curious to see what our group finds out, what we say about it. And then I've just got sort of unknown unknowns, things that I think are out there. I'm not really sure how to classify them, but I want to know sort of what's really hard and impossible about implementing standards-based grading. I don't think it's going to be very easy. It could be, but I just wonder, what's really hard? What do we have to be honest about and say, this doesn't work? What systems, procedures do we need to fix in order to make standards-based grading in our classroom? What is it about our school? What about the bureaucracy of bells, times, our team approaches? Are there other things that we need to do better? Power School, for instance. What's got to get fixed if we were to try to increase or make this a program for everybody to use? What has to be? What do we still need to know? What if we learned that we did not expect? Is there something out there that was just coming out of left field that kind of surprised us all? Does standards-based grading make a meaningful impact on assessing students? I'm curious about this. Do we feel like there's anything different after we've done it? If you were to give a student and their parents the report card, do you feel like you've had a more meaningful conversation with them? Do you feel like we actually have a grasp on what students actually know and can do? Or do we feel like, the old system of just kind of balling up all of our grades and homeworks and stuff into one letter, maybe it was the same? And finally, what other questions do we have? these questions and things I've just sort of gone through are ones that I've had over the last year, but I'm sure with 8 of us now, there's going to be more. And what are they, and can we find answers to them? In terms of timeline, really what I would like to do is before you leave for summer break, can you try and work on your report card? I really think that when we start in September, it would be great if you have that report card so you've started thinking about what kind of assessments you're going to give and how you're going to run your class. Steps 2, 3, and 4, those are all things that you can work on as you're teaching next year and as you're thinking about the class. But I really think getting that report card done will be best before you leave for summer. And again, I'll do another video on the report card just to kind of show you what I mean. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to stay after school, happy to meet before school. I'll even find time during summer break if that's when you'd like to work. I can't thank you enough for signing up for this pilot. I really look forward to working with you this spring and next fall, and hopefully solving some of the questions that I've kind of asked here and any other questions that we might design. Thank you so much, and again, feel free to contact me if you have any questions.